Pardon?
What? Wow!
It's given to me by an elderly gentleman, friend of the family, and he just knew me and my daughter liked horses and said, would I like it? And I said, yes, thank you very much, and put it up on the sort of shelf and that.
But you've looked at it ever since?
Yeah.
He's actually made in the early years of the 20th century by a chap called Louis de Monard, who was a Frenchman, obviously made of bronze with this wonderful sort of very nicely sort of worn patination. And Louis de Monard was following in a very well-established tradition, which the French established in the middle of the 19th century, of doing what we call animalia bronzes. In other words, they took the idea of the horse or any other animals and really sort of concentrated on what the horse actually looked like. And by the early 20th century, which is when this was done, I think they really got it right. I just like the way he's observed the whole thing of getting the leading rein stuck around the leg, and then it comes all the way back here, and there's a drape going over. So in terms of actually how you observe a horse, absolutely brilliant. Now, if you were a betting lady and wanted to put money on the horses, what would you think he'd romp home at in terms of value?
Hopefully maybe £500, but I don't know.
You could probably add a naught to that.
Pardon?
Yeah, I think you could certainly add a naught to that. I think we should be looking more on the region, certainly from an insurance point of view, of £5,000. Yeah, I think he's wonderful.
I take it you're not at all afraid of insects?
Oh, no.
Where did this magnificent lamp come from?
Well, my uncle acquired it about 20 years ago.
Did he?
It was bought on his travels. Mm-hmm. And it's now with us.
Is it? Are there any bits missing?
Yes, a fringe that goes round the top.
Tell me about that. It goes into all these little holes here.
Yes, it goes into all of the little holes, and it's beaded.
Beaded glass?
Yes.
And how far down does that hang?
About 4 inches.
Yes. And they're coloured, the beads,
Yes.
are they? Because this is a wonderful object that includes a number of materials. You've got bronze, principally, gilt bronze, and within the shade itself are these extraordinarily beautiful coloured glass panels in marigolds, a sort of pinkish marigold, and then these cabochon stones on the top here, which are the centres, probably, for some cast sunflowers. It's the most extraordinary object.
Thank you.
And something the like of which I've never seen before, which is a thrill. So it belonged to your uncle and he went on his travels. Did he travel anywhere in particular?
Yes, to France, America. He was born in Australia, so he travelled around.
Well, I think that he must have had quite advanced tastes to have been tempted to buy this lamp 20 or 30 years ago, because 20 or 30 years ago it would have been regarded as completely hideous. The thing is in the form of a macabre insect, I suspect a mayfly, and this mayfly has its mandibles out, gripping a sort of stylized lily pad, but it's not like any lily pad that really exists. So it's out there grabbing this thing with this weird expression on its face. In feeling, the thing is very much Art Nouveau. It's a sort of wacky, mad expression of the Art Nouveau with an organically inspired iris, and the Art Nouveau artists loved an iris because it had lots of curves and vigour and power to that organic form, and that makes up this extraordinary swirling base. If we turn it upside down, we'll see it says France, stamped twice. So the country of origin, after the Tariff Act of 1891, required the country of origin to be stamped on it. So it's after 1891, and I suppose I date it at around 1900 or so. The beauty of the thing for me must be when it's lit up, when you've got a beaded glass fringe and you look through these petals. Have you ever seen it illuminated?
Oh, yes.
And does it look extraordinary?
Oh, yes, it's beautiful.
Yes.
Quite stunning.
And what do you think something like this might be worth? You got any ideas?
Yeah,
It's like what?
about 5,000.
Not bad. I had on the tip of my tongue £5,000 to £8,000, £6,000 to £9,000 maybe. It would be fun to research and try and arrive at the original designer, because Some would say he might have been on drugs, but whether on drugs or not,
It's wonderful.
it's a really dazzling object.
If there's one thing that everybody thinks about when they think of Rolls-Royce, it's the spirit of ecstasy, this, I suppose, vision of ethereal beauty.
Yes.
It's a wonderful bronze. The original was designed by Charles Sykes in 1911, which is when the first Spirit of Ecstasy, of course a much smaller version than this,
Yes.
was first put on a Rolls-Royce. Interestingly enough, actually, it was an optional extra to begin with. She's commonly believed to be Eleanor Thornton, who was Charles Sykes' favourite model. Where did you get her from?
We bought it at an auction in New Jersey. We lived there for 5 years, and we bought it in 1987. It was an auction of Chinese things mostly, but this was one odd item there, which we spotted. It was not listed as the Spirit of Ecstasy.
It wasn't.
It was just a bronze figure.
Well, she certainly
And we
catches
bought it.
the eye. I mean, you couldn't really avoid seeing her, could you?
Not at all.
But very few people at the auction, actually.
Your lucky day.
Yes, it
Okay.
was.
What did you pay for it, as a matter of interest?
About $800.
$800. 1988.
That was about
87.
£400.
Yeah, okay. Well, it's a wonderful bronze figure. Bronze figures of this size were actually used by Rolls-Royce for their main showrooms, as a showroom model, if you like. Rolls-Royce, I believe, only know of about 9 or 10 of these models. But the interesting thing here is this particular one is numbered, what is that number?
28.
28.
It's 28.
28. So it may well be that there were more than 9 or 10 actually made. I think the records were lost during the war. The only other thing is that there are a tremendous number of facsimiles around, not just of bronze, which this is, and you can hear it, but also of plaster, coloured to look like bronze.
Yes.
It's very difficult to know without a really good provenance whether this is an original that was made specifically for one of the Rolls-Royce franchises, or whether this is a later casting. The only thing I would say is, if you look at the base here, this black marble base, it's actually quite unusual to find these with a rectangular base, because all of the later castings I've seen are on circular bases. So this is quite a good plus point, I have to say.
Okay.
So you can't just discount that, discount it. What about value? The facsimiles, the later castings, are not worth a huge amount of money. And they can fetch anywhere between £800 and £1,200. If we were able to prove that this was absolutely genuine, that it came out of a dealer's showroom, then the likelihood is it could be worth £8,000 to £10,000.
Wow.
So it may well pay you
Yes.
to do a little bit of poking about, a little bit of
research.
research.
It might be worth a trip back to the States to find out.
Well, I think it could be.
My husband bought them in the early 60s because we liked them. We paid £50 for them, which we thought was rather a lot in those days.
£50?
Yes.
Right, yes. First of all, the condition is absolutely stunning. I mean, everything is as crisp as the day it was made. The glassing, it's just so sharp, everything is just as you would want it to be. Finding a pair of claret jugs is unusual. They turn up, but most often you simply find a claret jug.
Yeah.
We've got these wonderful fruiting vines spreading across the lid, and the vines intertwined. You see how they just cross over and over down into the base there. So often when you get something like this, it's been dulled with polishing and so on over the...
Well, I've only cleaned it 4 times since I've had
4
them.
times, right? Have you used them?
Not for wine, no.
No. What have you used them for then?
Well, we mostly had them in the cupboard where we could see in the glass case.
Oh, right, just to
Yes.
enjoy.
Yes.
Just to enjoy. Well, they're made in London, and we've got a date here of 1838, but the maker, and really could not be better. The maker in this case is Paul Storr.
Oh, fabulous. I have heard of him.
It's certainly a name to conjure
Yes.
with. One of the greatest of the silversmiths that has ever been. And it is an early date for claret jugs. They They started to get going in the Regency period. You don't see many until you get a little later into the reign of Queen Victoria. So we've got absolutely top maker. We've got a pair. Really, we should be looking at a value of somewhere around 30,000 plus.
What? Wow, that's fabulous.
So a little improvement on the 55.
Oh, that's wonderful. Oh, I do wish my husband was here to hear that.
So how long have you had these pieces?
I actually inherited them when I was 3 years old.
Gosh, what an inheritance.
Yes, they're lovely, aren't they?
So where did they come from?
They were my grandparents on my mother's side. I know that my grandparents had them in India for most of their working life.
Right.
Then they retired to South Africa, and I went there with them, and then they came to me about 27 years ago.
You don't happen to know when your grandparents got married?
I don't, no.
No, my reason for asking is because a set like this was very often a wedding present from a groom to his bride.
Oh, right.
It was, and that goes right back into the 17th century, this sort of period. Of course, what we've got here, the hand mirror, a couple of brushes, this wonderful box. I have to say that box, I think is a stunner. We've got the inscription running around here, Omar Ramsden et Alwyn Carr me fecerunt. And that, of course, the very famous Ramsden and Carr partnership. Now, they actually were from Sheffield, although these are London pieces.
Right.
We've got maker's mark of Omar Ramsden and Alwyn Carr there, but the date in this case is really quite evocative. It's 1915.
Right.
Started right towards the beginning of the First World War. I mean, the decoration, I think, is wonderful for that period. We've got St. George and the Dragon. Of course, 1950, what could be better at that time? I think that's wonderful. The roses became very much a feature of Ramsden and Carr work, Tudor roses. Had you thought in terms of value?
Not at all.
I think today I would not be surprised to see that selling somewhere between about, say, £6,000 and £8,000.
Really?
Really.
I'm in shock.
Okay, well, don't be too shocked. Now, let's have a look at this jug. And, oh gosh, what an inheritance. Claret jug, of course. And, of course, we've got the same makers, Ramsden and Carr. But here we're a bit earlier, actually. We're back to 1905. A far more peaceful time. And what have we got? We've got grapes. The roses are there as well. Of course, it's also interesting to see on this as well, this hammered surface. And this was very much a reaction against industrialization. And what they were saying is, look, this is handmade. On the top, of course, we've got these cabochon stones. And that's very much arts and crafts movement coming through. The idea that you would use the stone in its much more natural state. So, had you thought about value on this one?
No.
Right. I think with this, we're actually looking at, again, £6,000 to £8,000.
Wow. Thank you. It's amazing.
It was a very nice little inheritance, that.
Thank you very much.
And thank you so much for bringing them in.
Delightful little communion set. We've got the chalice and the wine.
Yes.
And the paten in the bottom. Do you use them all the time?
I use that is my travelling communion set for visiting sick parishioners.
Ah, lovely.
It is always in use.
I mean, obviously we used quite a lot by the Padres during the war and so in the trenches as well. It's quite nice. I mean, it's nicely gilded on the inside. It's got the marks here for Hayne and Cater, and that's London 1852. And quite a nice little set actually, and it's obviously been well used by looking at the case. Yeah. They're fairly straightforward. We see quite a number of them in the sale rooms, and they usually make up to about a couple of £100. So, you know, I presume you want some idea for insurance.
Please.
So
yeah.
I would say add at least another 100 on that. Put 300 on it just for insurance, so you know that it's covered.
Yeah.
Now this one's an entirely different kettle of fish altogether. It's interesting because obviously there's an inscription on there in Latin, 1633. I don't know if you can translate the rest for me.
Well, it's a chalice given to the church in that year, 1633.
Well, it actually predates that, because if we look at the hallmark, which I'm afraid is very, very rough, it actually goes back to 1609, James I. And of course, unfortunately, silversmiths in those days didn't count for people like us trying to trace them afterwards. They put it right up on the top, where, you know, we've got 400 years of people taking communion, and it's rubbed the marks right down, so it's quite difficult to decipher them. But they're there, and I say it's 1609. The nice thing about it is you could actually see how the silversmith has actually raised up this bowl with all the hammer marks all the way around it. Can you see all the planets?
I wondered how
they're all hammer
like
marks where he's actually raised it from the flat. So it's quite interesting. You've got this nice knot stem and also quite a nice pedestal foot on it. The pattern, I'm a little bit dubious about this one. It does actually fit on the top, but I suspect they weren't a pair to start with.
According to the records, it's about 1580 is the date we've been given.
Right.
But where they got that date from, I do not know.
Well, I don't, because there's no date on it anywhere, but I certainly wouldn't dispute it. And I mean, it does show, as you can see here, it does show traces of parcel gilding, and they do go quite well together. It must be a royalist church, your one, is it?
No, the church is actually very, very much older. The tower was founded about the year 800.
But they must have gone for the king, because they certainly didn't hand the silver in when they should have done in 1640.
Well, they were well known for not doing as they were told.
Absolutely, because it should have been handed in to help the Cromwellian rebellion, of course. Anyway, I would have thought for insurance you're probably looking at somewhere around about the £9,000 mark. So, you know, that's the sort of figure you've got to be looking at for insurance, because that's going to cost you that to replace it.
Right.
So, where on earth do you keep it?
We were broken into just over a year ago, so I'm afraid most of our silver is now in the bank. It has to be kept under lock and key.
Anyway, thanks for taking the trouble to bring them along today.
Many, many thanks.
Well, if I was going to use the word exquisite about anything, I think I'd use it for this. It's very small, concentrated and extremely beautiful. Tell me about it.
It came from my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, who was raised in Ireland. And it came to me because my mother, when she died about 8-9 years ago, there were a whole lot of artifacts from my grandmother which she wanted to divide up between myself, my sister and my two cousins. And she said, you can draw lots for who goes first, and all the artifacts can be laid out on the dining room table, and then you pick them in order. And I took an instant shine to that, and I said, well, I hope I'm going to get it. I was actually the one that got the fourth straw. And so I had to wait while my three others chose, and luckily they were all far more practical than I was, and they all took things like toast racks or knives and forks. And so when my turn came, I got that.
No, that must have been an absolutely heart-stopping moment, actually, when you think that the roulette wheel's not spinning in your direction. But it absolutely did, didn't it?
Yes,
and my goodness, what a fantastic condition, too. What do you know about its contents?
Well, it's got this little paper almanac inside, hasn't it?
Yes, full of all kinds of interesting facts, and it's a very sweet engraving of a view of London at this time. And there are the phases of the sun and the moon, aren't there?
Yes,
and
yes.
There are lists of the Lord Mayor of London and lists of
Kings
the
and Queens.
Kings and Queens, and the senior dignitaries of Queen Victoria's court. Her absolute favourite, Lord Melbourne, is mentioned top of the list. Waits for stamps. Very conveniently, it's dated 1840, and I'm sure the goldsmith's work is exactly from that period. It's very interesting to me, actually, because had we not that external evidence, I might just have been, for a while, thinking along the lines that this could be a piece of 18th century English goldsmith's work. Right. It's very much in the manner of a goldsmith called Strahan, working in London in the second half of the 18th century. And I think in a strange way, this is an 18th century revival. 1840 is certainly in the reign of Queen Victoria. In fact, it was the year that she was married. And so this is an early Victorian piece of London goldsmith's work. And why does it exist? It's hopelessly impractical, isn't it? Bound in beautiful silk here. And its function is really very much secondary to the fact that it's a truly beautiful object. For these sort of hopelessly useless and beautiful things, there is a terminology. We call them objects of virtue, which really has its etymological roots in the fact that they're toys. These are toys for grown-ups. Yeah. And they come from an age, really, when there's no television, no radio. In the evenings, amusements were taken in odd ways, and one would have a collector's cabinet with goldsmith's work and get these beautiful things out in candlelight and look at them and view them with amazement. Well, a beautiful thing, probably to give a beautiful girl in 1840. We don't know exactly who that is, but boy, we share in that life, don't we, by seeing it?
Yes. It'll probably be the grandmother of my grandmother. That would fit datal-wise, I would think.
Well, marvellous, and it's a very rare sight, and I think this is a very enviable object, and with envy, of course, comes value. I mean, if this were, and it isn't going to happen, but if it turned up for sale, it would excite an enormous amount of interest. I mean, I'd want it really badly, and I would bid, my goodness, what would I bid? I'd bid £5,000, £6,000.
Good gracious.
And I might even go one more at 7. I think it's a completely marvellous thing, and thank you for bringing it.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Tell me, you keep this in a cardboard box in the attic?
No, not at all. No. It has an honoured place in an alcove in our sitting room.
It must look wonderful. Well, it's clearly a Buddhistic figure.
Yeah.
And Buddhistic figures are extremely difficult to attribute as to where they came from. Because like Russian icons, the idea is to keep the things the same as possible throughout generations. But once we start looking at it, maybe there are some clues. We've got on here some characters which are cut out of metal.
Yeah.
Which is very unusual. I haven't seen that before.
I didn't know that.
But the characters are either North Indian or Tibetan.
Yeah.
So that, we think, maybe is where it comes from.
All right.
The mandala here is carved with scrolling clouds. We come down here. The Buddha is standing on a lotus throne, which is his symbol. The lotus is the symbol of purity. We come down to these very strange and unusual flower leaf scrolls, which I've not seen before, to a group of 6 immortals who've got various attributes, and these are Buddhist immortals, or Lohan. And then down to the bottom, we've got a dragon, a sort of kailin, I think it's supposed to be, a turtle, and the turtle supports the world in part of the mythology. Now, the quality of the carving, because this is all carved wood, which has then been gilded, this is gold leaf on here, is of very, very high quality. Much better quality than one would have expected had it come from Tibet or India. Nor does it say to me China, oddly enough. But when we get back up here again, the quality says to me nowhere else but Japan.
Now that is interesting. That I hadn't thought.
At this date, and I think we're talking about 1890, 1900, this was made in Japan, possibly for export to Tibet.
Right.
I think it's absolutely splendid. Because it's Japanese, it's going to be worth more than if were it anything else. More than Chinese, more than Indian, more than Tibetan. I think we're looking at about £10,000 to £15,000.
Right. Oh.
I must say, these are really wonderful sculptural objects. There's very little else you can say, except they are marvellous pieces of sculpture. They are, of course, salt cellars, in fact. That's what they were designed to do. Now, these were made by this very famous goldsmith called Paul Storr. 3 of them were made in 1813, and this one was made actually in 1811. And you can see a date letter Q there, as opposed to all the rest, which have a date letter S for 1813. Paul Storr was a remarkable goldsmith, probably the best native goldsmith this country ever produced. Made absolutely breathtaking things. He started his working life in about 1792 and retired, I think, in about 1835, 36, something like that. The design for these probably originates in the 16th century. There's a very famous salt cellar made for Francis I by Benvenuto Cellini, but I think the design that Paul Storr, who made these, will have seen and slightly got a feeling for was actually at Windsor Castle. At Windsor Castle there are some sauce boats and salt cellars made by a man called Nicholas Spremont in the 1740s that have very much this idea of shells being held by sculptural mermaids, mermen, tritons, and so on. And I think that he will have seen those because he worked for a firm, or worked with a firm, that worked very largely for George III. And he will have seen those at Windsor Castle, probably even repaired them from time to time. And I think this is where he will have got the general idea. Where did you get them?
Well, my father gave them to me about a year, 18 months before he died.
The gilding on them is so wonderful. It's so thick and heavy, and just the quality of the work. Everything is absolutely brilliant. They're not worn. All the chiselling on the little mermen here is absolutely brilliant. They are really tremendous salt cellars. Have you any idea of what you think they're worth?
I haven't any idea whatsoever. No.
Well, yes. Well, it's difficult.
I see.
It's difficult, but I've been looking at these and telling you bits about them and trying to think myself. But I think, on balance, if I had to buy these, either from a private house or at an auction or whatever, if I had to buy them, I think I'd have to be looking at £40,000.
Good Lord. You do surprise me.